All right, welcome to the show. It's the Extra here on KRDO News Radio, and we were thrilled to have in studio with us. She is Catherine Hammond of the Hammond Law Group, fresh in from New Hampshire, I understand. So are you a little jet lagged, Catherine, this morning?
A tiny bit jet lagged, but I had such a lovely, relaxing weekend, mostly by a lake, so...
That's nice. That's nice.
Very worthwhile.
So are the leaves turning up that way?
They are just beginning to. Yeah, gorgeous already.
I'm glad you had a good time. You had an early morning meeting this morning, too, so wow, right back into the fire, huh?
Right, but there are lots of fun, important things to do, so.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with the basics here, Catherine. As I sit here today, I'm wondering things like, should I come to you to talk about my will? Should I come to you about talking about the eventuality that I am going to pass from this earth and what needs to happen next?
The answer would be a resounding yes.
Big capital letters,
right.
Huh?
If you are somebody who might possibly either become incapacitated or die at some point, then yes, you should be talking to an estate planning attorney today.
And
so if you fit into one of those categories, you might become disabled or die, talk to an attorney.
And the sooner the better, right?
Right.
I mean, because that equals peace of mind. And we're going to talk a little bit about dying. Now, it's not the sexiest subject on the planet, but it certainly is inevitable for all of us until they find the magic pill that keeps us alive forever. But I think that's a few years off, as we know it. So there's a lot of controversy in Colorado, Catherine, about the aid in dying legislation that is going to be up for a vote this November. What have you been hearing at your office?
Interestingly, I have not heard very much talk about the aid in dying legislation in my office, meaning through my clients.
Right.
I haven't heard any of my clients talking about it. And so I'm really getting my information about how people feel more from the street and from the news and from Google.
Yeah, and it's really interesting the way it's gone. I mean, there's a really solid block on both sides of the issue. Mm-hmm. Some people feel like, well, it's very humanitarian and that we should allow folks who have terminal conditions that are evaluated by several doctors, and you have a terminal diagnosis of less than 6 months to live, and they should be in charge of their own death. They should be able to determine the time and nature of their death. And on the other side, you have the block that says, look, this is a really tough call because you're going to go down a slippery slope here, and you may see greedy relatives and people such as that get involved and make the decision for someone instead of the person actually making the decision. So the slippery slopers versus the right to die folks, the folks who would like to see this passed. It's been a very interesting debate so far.
It has been. Yeah, and I don't know if your listeners are familiar with exactly what I think it's Prop 106 says in terms of, as you mentioned, if you have what has been determined to be a terminal condition, more than one doctor agrees with that, and you have less than 6 months to live, you would have the right to have a doctor prescribe to you medication that you could take, and it must be self-administered.
I was going to say, that's really the key, isn't it? It's the self-administration, because the doctors are not going to do it for you.
Right. We don't want to go the Dr. Kevorkian route and have physician-assisted suicide at this point in Colorado is not the plan for this particular piece of legislation. So,
well, it's going to be interesting to see how it turns out. How would that affect you, do you think?
I don't know how it would affect me. I think it affects two groups of people, three groups of people. It affects physicians a whole lot. What an incredible burden to put on them. I've already seen, and probably most people have heard of situations where somebody's diagnosis has been a little bit off. For example, we had a client a few years ago who had a stroke,
right,
and was brain dead.
Right.
And within a couple of days, the doctors were telling wife that she should go ahead and release him from the machines that were keeping him alive.
Pull the plug.
Exactly. And the interesting thing was, just a few weeks earlier, they had come into our office and done an estate plan.
Oh my gosh!
And
Really, it was
signed
just a few weeks.
Just a few weeks,
Oh, man.
less than 3 weeks.
Wow.
So they had signed documents called living wills that say how you feel about artificial life support if you have a terminal condition and you've been in a coma for at least a week. So the living will doesn't come into play until you've been unconscious or in a coma for at least 7 days. But that doesn't mean that you can't be released from the life-preserving machines before that. So living will only comes into play then. So doctors say 2 days into this that she should go ahead and pull the plug.
Right.
Let him pass away with dignity because there's no hope that he could ever return to life.
Right.
And so we got on the phone with her. I talked to her several times and talked through exactly what the law said her rights were. She still, as his agent under his healthcare power of attorney, had the right to make the decisions on his behalf since he couldn't communicate those. So having that document that says who can make the decisions is really important.
Yes, it is.
Aside from that, the doctors could be the ones making the decisions. So, or a court. So they're telling her to end his life. I explained to her that she has the sole right to make that decision. And she feels very strongly that in their discussions over signing the document, he wanted his life preserved for at least 7 days, just in case. Just in case.
One never knows.
One never knows.
Miracles
theoretically,
do happen.
right? Right. That's what we hear. But when the doctors tell you that,
Right. Chances are it's not. But
no. And doctors in this case said not chances, but absolutely he never could come out of this. And so she decided to keep him alive for 7 days. Day 6.5, he woke up.
No.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. And several months later, we called the house and he answered the phone. Right.
Wow.
So a diagnosis is really imperfect. So that's one of...
That's a huge example, though.
Right. Huge example. There are some other problems. And I'll say, I think that dying with dignity is an important thing. And then the question is just, what does that mean, and what are the dangers back and forth with legislation like this?
Right, and it all depends on how the legislation is written. I mean, it can come down to a word or a phrase,
right,
that's in the legislation that maybe turns the tide completely for you.
Right. And you talked about the possibility for somebody to be coerced into, and the argument against it, because somebody could be maybe talked into it by their family members, greedy relatives, things like that.
Guilted into it.
Exactly.
That's my fear.
But in addition to that, there is, and I get to see this up close working with so many people through the dying process, there is an ability, even without somebody else providing any kind of pressure. We are such an independence-driven society.
True.
And when we are no longer independent, when we become an emotional and physical and financial burden to those that we love, we can put that guilt trip in our own heads.
Right.
And we might coerce ourselves into not being a burden to our loved ones by doing it this way. The financial costs of end-of-life care in some situations are really, really high. Right.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about this on the other side, Catherine. It's been such a fascinating conversation already. We're running late. We'll take this short break. Back with more with Catherine Hammond coming right after this here on KRDO. Welcome back to the program. It's the Extra here on KRDO News Radio. One of our favorite people in the whole world, Catherine Hammond, is with us, the Hammond Law Group here in Colorado Springs, and we've been talking about the aid in dying legislation that we will be voting on come November. And Catherine, we talked about the fact that, this can be the matter of a turn of a phrase that allows you to proceed with your wishes or perhaps not. And that's why, these things, even if it does pass, it's probably going to be challenged in court, and they're going to have to figure out if it's constitutional or not. I'm thinking.
You think?
Yeah, I do.
Right, yes. It's a heated enough issue that I would expect there to be challenges.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that's the most striking to me is just the way that we've gone in terms of being a greedy, litigious society. What happens, for the medical professionals in terms of let's say that we have a doctor who has known their patient for quite a while, knows the patient, may even know their family, has seen their life progress and has seen them now come down with a terminal illness, and knows that this person is of sound mind to a decision that they want to exit this earth with dignity.
And on their own terms.
And not be a burden to their family. And so the doctor, let's say, makes this decision to give a prescription for the drugs that would help somebody to end their life. What happens just from a litigation perspective, to me, in the doctor's mind, for very good reason, about what if their decision is questioned?
Right.
What if somebody claims that it wasn't actually a terminal condition? What if? All you have to do to make a lot of money in our society is make up a lawsuit.
Yes. We've seen it time and time again.
Yep. There are a lot of folks who love to litigate. And, yeah,
this is one of the dangers. And once again, I fear the slippery slope. I haven't read the legislation thoroughly enough to figure out which side I'm actually going to come down on in November and
Right.
vote for. So, I think we need to do a lot of education beforehand. And, once again, we don't care how you vote, just vote. And we'll have to take a look at just what's involved prior to the November vote.
Right. And the Colorado Health Institute put out a report that you can find on Google very easily, I'm sure, called Aid in Dying, Colorado Confronts a Difficult Policy Question, that I think does a really nice job of looking at all sides of the issue and raises the concerns that different folks raise. Obviously, in terms of clergy, I think most clergy fall on the side of not supporting legislation that would allow us to end our own lives,
Right.
And in any way that's not completely natural. And then there actually are some clergy, some spiritual leaders who are in favor of this legislation. So even for those in religious communities, good to really investigate.
Exactly. Catherine Hammond, our guest. We're going to take our bottom of the hour break, get you caught up with some news right after this here on KRDO. Stay here. Welcome back to the show. It's The Extra here on KRDO News Radio. I'm Paul Richards. Catherine Hammond, the Hammond Law Group, is our guest here on the program today, fresh in from a little weekend jaunt to New Hampshire. And Catherine, thanks for making the time for us. It's always great to see you. How can people get a hold of you?
They can go to our website at coloradoestateplan.com or call our office, 719-520-1474.
Very cool. So we've been talking about the healthcare legislation, the aid in dying legislation we'll be voting on come November, and the complications that can be involved. And we were talking, Catherine, about healthcare agents, health-related power of attorney bestowal onto people. And it really is, as we move forward and get older and more infirm, it's really important to have that POA in place, isn't it?
Absolutely vital. So power of attorney can do a couple of different things. Certain powers of attorney are for the financial side of things.
Right.
If you're incapacitated, and it might even be a temporary thing, you're in a car accident, you have a brain injury, you have a stroke, and then you recover, or it might be for some sort of permanent injury or illness. Financial power of attorney would allow somebody else to take care of your banking and real estate and investment transactions, at least theoretically. There are some problems with powers of attorney. I encourage everybody to look at the possibility of doing a revocable living trust instead, because it just lasts a lot longer. It's a whole lot more effective. So, but either a financial power of attorney or a revocable living trust takes care of the financial side of things.
Okay, but what about the medical?
On the medical side of things, there are some other documents that you need. The healthcare power of attorney in Colorado says this is the person who I want to make my medical decisions if I can't communicate them. So that would be things like the situation that I referenced earlier with the client whose spouse was tasked with whether to pull the plug or not. She had the right to make those decisions because she was named as the healthcare agent.
And it's lucky she waited till day 7.
No kidding. Right.
What an incredible story that is.
Right. And then you also want to sign a living will that says how you feel about artificial life support, which is the document she and her husband had discussed. And then a universal HIPAA release that says the following people always have a right to my medical information.
Boy,
people are surprised.
That is hugely important now.
It's hugely important for every single person 18 and over, because if you land in the hospital after an accident, your family doesn't even have the right to call the hospital and find out whether or not you're there, and if you are, what room you're in, so they can come visit you.
Well, I remember back in the day, Catherine, this was so different, because when I was a young news reporter, right after the earth cooled, all you had to do, if there was an accident victim or somebody had been shot overnight or those kinds of things, and you were making check calls in the morning, you could check on their condition and it was no big deal. It was like, oh, well, that person's in fair condition now. That
Right.
person's in serious condition, whatever it might be. But those HIPAA rules have been really, that's something else again.
No kidding. And it's well-intentioned
Right.
to give us some privacy, but we've lost all common sense. And it's mostly, again, because of litigation.
Right.
So as far as the aid in dying legislation goes, with the healthcare power of attorney, which everybody needs to have in place anyway, once you're 18, you need a healthcare power of attorney. The way that could impact things is probably worth thinking through. So right now we don't have aid in dying legislation in place. We don't have the right to that in Colorado, but we might either come soon or years down the road.
Well, it seems like it's going to be an issue that we're going to be dealing with in perpetuity.
Absolutely.
One way or the
It's a
other.
growing number of states. Colorado would be state number 6 to have some kind of similar legislation. So, and if you move, it could be an option as well. So having in your healthcare power of attorney now some reference to how you would want your healthcare agent to handle situations where you might meet all the criteria but not be able to communicate your own decision, to communicate to your agent ahead of time, hey, if these things are true about whatever my situation is, and you can tell that I'm suffering, and the only way to relieve my suffering is to take advantage of these medications that
Right.
would end my life more quickly, that's something that you would perhaps want to consider having in your healthcare power of attorney today, even though the legislation hasn't passed. Or if you don't want your agent
Right.
to ever consider those things. And a lot of people feel very strongly that way. And that would also be an important thing to communicate in your healthcare power of attorney. The most important thing, though, to me is sit down and have a conversation with your family about what quality of life means to you.
Yes, I think that's extremely important. And I have my own personal reasons for saying that.
Right. There's an organization called the Conversation Project that recommends these death dinners, they call them, where you have your family gather, ideally over a meal, because that's a really sweet communal way to
It's a
have
very
hard
easy way to break the ice.
Exactly.
The ice is already
break
broken.
the bread, break the ice.
And
Yep.
have a glass of wine, everybody.
Right,
All
maybe
right?
a couple. No, probably you don't want to have a couple until you've gotten through the important
Right.
part of the conversation. But it's a difficult conversation, vital for your family to know what quality of life means to you, because even apart from the aid in dying legislation, there are a lot of things that we can do these days medically to prolong our lives.
Right, but not necessarily provide quality. I mean, we've had this discussion about quality versus quantity a lot. And the thing is, the average person lives to 76-ish now. Women have a tendency to live longer than men do. And, we're talking, like my wife's average age patient is about 86.
Wow.
So, and that's the average. But you're dealing with folks who are going to be living, and you look at the kids today, and they're going to be living probably an average, who knows? If Google makes a breakthrough, they may live forever. But the thing is, they're going to probably, with medical advances, be able to live well into their 90s. And in some cases, just like now, there's going to be plenty of quality of life. And in some cases, there won't be.
Right. And everybody's definition of quality of life is very, very different. And I know we've mentioned the book before called Being Mortal.
Right.
I highly, highly recommend that everybody read that book because it at least brings up so many of the important issues about independence, such a high value in our society, and then all of a sudden one day when you hit a certain age or functioning ability, you're supposed to give up your independence but still be happy being alive.
Right.
And the whole quality of life versus quantity of life, I haven't found a better book at exploring those issues so that then you can bring them to that conversation with your family, because the greatest gift that you can give your loved ones is that if they end up having to make one of those decisions, they can make it. Yeah, they can make it from an informed perspective, understanding what your wishes were.
Catherine Hammond, our guest on the program. We'll spend our remaining time with Catherine right after this here on KRDO. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. It's The Extra here on KRDO News Radio. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation with Catherine Hammond of the Hammond Law Group. Catherine, I wanted to ask you about do not resuscitate orders. You were talking to me earlier about an actual DNR tattoo that people can get. Is that right?
I was. So one of the trends out there in the world has been people who have decided they don't want to be resuscitated. They don't want their lives prolonged. They're okay with living life until their life ends, but they don't want it prolonged by extraordinary means if it doesn't have to be. And so people will sign a DNR, usually signed with your doctor and or hospital, directly with your medical provider, that says if my heart stops beating or I stop breathing, I don't want you to resuscitate me.
Yeah, don't hit me with a defibrillator. I'm fine.
There's a problem with those in that if you're out and about somewhere or even possibly at home and one of those things happens and somebody calls 911, they aren't going to know that you don't want to be resuscitated, and so they would typically resuscitate you. So people, in an effort to make sure that their wishes are known, will tattoo the letters DNR on their body, maybe on their chest, maybe on their wrist, maybe multiple places, so that doctors would know, I don't want you to resuscitate me, which sounds like a great idea, and it sounds really clear. But again, in our greedy, litigious society, not so clear. First of all, does not meet all the requirements typically of legal execution.
I was going to say, it's the legal part of it that gets involved here, right? Because,
Always.
A tattoo can say anything.
Yep, it might be, the name of your favorite band
exactly.
or Department of Natural Resources,
sure.
And you don't have the witnesses and your signature typically, so maybe you could get those tattooed on you. But the other thing is a medical directive has to be changeable. And a tattoo is pretty hard to change. And so last week, as I was talking about this issue with somebody, I looked up what the medical journals say. And they tell doctors that they should still go ahead and resuscitate even if they see a tattoo. I didn't find any that recommended agast that.
Really?
Because of the liability.
Exactly. It's always a liability.
If you end somebody's life in a split-second decision, the liability is just way, way, way too high. And I actually wanted to come back to that as far as the aid in dying legislation. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that I was concerned about doctors. The problem, the statute itself would say that doctors are not liable as long as they meet all the criteria of the law. Right. However, the problem is that it specifically requires doctors to meet or exceed the standard of care for end-of-life medical care.
Okay, so what does that mean? Meet or exceed?
Right. That's where there's a lot of gray area and where a doctor could be subject to liability.
Right, and there's a lot of wiggle room in there. And that's, of course, why doctors carry malpractice.
Yep.
It's statutory in the state of Colorado.
Yep, for good reason.
Yeah, and this is only going to be a bigger and bigger question moving forward as more of us age, and we have to make that decision about quality of life versus quantity of life. Hopefully they can even out at some point.
Yeah. Let's keep talking about it as a community. It's important stuff.
It is. I talked to my buddy Greg Koopman, who does the Senior Talk show here on KRDO, and we were talking about the numbers. Just the sheer numbers are staggering. And then he is at least happy that the state has put together a panel of experts trying to figure out a statewide strategy to deal with our aging population, because it's only going to get bigger.
Right.
Not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah. And it could be such a blessing to so many of us. Like I dream about the ways that we could incorporate community and mentoring and all kinds of wonderful things with the aging population and the costs associated with that and the lack of people available to care for them and the people who really could learn. And like, how can we bring all of this together and make it an overall win-win?
Right, and bring the legal aspect to the table as well, because
right.
that's a huge project for anybody who's once again going to die at some point.
Yep.
Catherine,
you
wonderful.
And me.
Yeah, that would be us. Hopefully not this afternoon. Catherine, thanks so much for being here. I'm glad you had such a good time up in New Hampshire, and I hope to see you again real soon. And how can people get a hold of you?
They can come to one of our workshops. We have workshops tomorrow afternoon and evening in Castle Rock. Go to our website, coloradoestateplan.com, or call our office, 719-520-1474.
Well, it sounds like you're going to dispense a lot of great information. I know the people that come to the seminars are going to be enlightened, and they're probably going to be scratching their heads afterwards thinking, wow, I didn't know a whole lot about this, but I think I better educate myself.
We hear a lot of that feedback. Thanks for what you do in our community.
Well,
make a difference.
More than happy to do it, and I appreciate you contributing to the program when you do. So enjoy, and we'll get you on the schedule here real soon, and we'll do that. So I'll be talking to you real soon.
Thanks so much.
You bet. Catherine Hammond, Hammond Law Group here in Colorado Springs. She can help you get your stuff in a pile, if you know what I mean. Coming up here next, it is the Tom Martino program, the Troubleshooter. He is going to help you. If you've been ripped off, if you've been maligned by a company, they will help you get restitution, that sort of thing. So Tom is coming up here in just a couple minutes. Wanted to remind you that on KRDO's Morning News tomorrow, we will be talking with Mayor John Suthers. We have a lot to talk to the mayor about. He's been quite the busy cat of late. We're going to be talking to him about progress that they've made in the 2C paving work around the city, and really a whole lot more. So be sure and be with us about 7:35 tomorrow morning here on KRDO. Also on this program tomorrow, we'll talk with our buddy Mike Perini from Woodland Park. We'll talk about your need for a public relations company and why your company ought to be thinking about it. So have yourselves a great afternoon. We will talk to you tomorrow morning right here on KRDO News Radio.